This content is for informational purposes only and does not replace professional medical advice. Always consult a qualified healthcare provider for personal health concerns. We are constantly bombarded by bold percentages in the news, often designed to grab our attention and trigger an emotional response. It is easy to assume that a 50% reduction in risk means that for every 2 people who take a pill, 1 person is saved from a devastating diagnosis. Imagine you are scrolling through your phone and see a flashy banner ad for a cholesterol-lowering drug. It screams that the medication slashes your risk of a heart attack by half. Most of us would naturally assume that if we take this pill, our chances of suffering a cardiac event are cut down the middle. However, statistics are often presented in a way that highlights relative risk to make a treatment seem far more effective than it truly is. Technically, 1 is 50% of 2, which allows the company to market a 50% reduction. But for the actual patient, the difference is 1 in 1,000. This is the hidden language of medical data, a landscape where numbers are frequently used to influence our perception rather than inform our decision-making. When we confuse relative risk with absolute risk, we lose the ability to accurately weigh the potential benefits of a treatment against its side effects or costs. By understanding the nuance between these 2 types of risk, you can reclaim your power as a patient and cut through the noise of medical marketing. We need to look past the percentages to find the actual, tangible impact on human lives. Let's pull back the curtain on the math behind the medicine and look at how these figures are constructed. To understand the gap between these 2 metrics, we first have to ground ourselves in the basic arithmetic of probability. It is the simple frequency of an outcome within a specific group. If you reach in blindly, your absolute risk of pulling out a red marble is exactly 2%. It doesn't compare itself to anything else, it just states the facts as they exist. Instead of looking at the total population, it measures the change between 2 different groups. Suppose we introduce a second jar that only has 1 red marble. Mathematically, that sounds dramatic, doesn't it? But look closely, we are still only talking about a difference of 1 single marble. This is where the confusion often begins. But if that condition was incredibly rare to begin with, say, affecting only 2 people out of every 1,000, then a 50% reduction merely brings that number down to 1 person per 1,000. Think of it like buying a lottery ticket. If you buy a second ticket, your relative risk of winning has technically doubled. You haven't fundamentally changed your odds in a meaningful way, even though the relative math suggests a massive leap. Research suggests that when we focus only on the relative change, we often lose sight of the baseline reality. Now that we have established how these numbers are calculated, we need to examine why this specific mathematical framing is so often used to influence our perceptions of health breakthroughs. Given this, you might wonder why scientists and pharmaceutical companies gravitate toward relative risk if it obscures the full picture. When a study reports that a new intervention cuts the risk of a specific event by 50%, our brains naturally interpret that as a massive improvement. However, that figure is mathematically hollow without the context of the baseline risk, the actual, underlying probability of that event occurring in the first place. Imagine a condition that affects only 2 people out of every 1,000. That headline sounds life-changing. You have prevented a single incident, but the overwhelming majority of people who took that medication saw no change in their personal outcome. By emphasizing the 50% figure, organizations can amplify the perceived impact of a drug, making a modest clinical benefit appear extraordinary. This creates a significant hurdle for your own health literacy. If the baseline risk is already tiny, a large relative reduction might mean very little in practical, day-to-day terms. Conversely, if the baseline risk is high, even a small relative change could represent a substantial number of lives saved. Medical professionals recommend that patients look past the bold print to find the number needed to treat, or NNT. It grounds those abstract percentages in reality. It shifts the conversation from a vague sense of improvement to a concrete understanding of whether a particular path is right for your unique circumstances. You stop asking how much better a treatment is in a vacuum, and start asking what it actually means for your life. Now that we have unpacked the psychology behind these numbers, we need to look at how these statistical distortions can directly cloud our judgment during routine doctor visits. This brings us to a vital skill: identifying the red flags that suggest you are being sold a narrative rather than a medical breakthrough. When you encounter headlines boasting that a new medication cuts your risk of a heart attack by 50%, your initial reaction is likely one of relief or excitement. That 50% figure is almost always a relative risk reduction, a metric that effectively ignores the baseline frequency of the event. To see through this, we have to look for the absolute risk. Mathematically, 5 is half of 10, which allows the pharmaceutical company to claim a 50% reduction in risk. However, in reality, your personal risk dropped from 1% to 0.5%. When you view it through this lens, the benefit becomes far less dramatic than the marketing materials suggest. This is why medical professionals often point toward a metric called the number needed to treat, or NNT. If a drug has an absolute risk reduction of 0.1%, it means you would need to treat 1,000 people just to prevent a single event. If you are one of the 999 people who do not experience that specific benefit, you are still potentially exposed to the side effects and the financial costs of that treatment. If they are missing, the information is incomplete by design. Research suggests that when patients are shown both relative and absolute figures, their willingness to start a new medication often changes significantly. You deserve to know the actual magnitude of the impact a treatment might have on your day-to-day life, rather than being swayed by a percentage that hides the true scale of the data. Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward becoming an empowered partner in your own care. But knowing how to interpret these numbers is only half the battle. The other half involves understanding how your own personal history and individual risk factors should actually shape the conversation you have with your healthcare provider. To bridge this gap between abstract statistics and your personal well-being, you need a strategy for your next appointment. When your physician suggests a new medication or a preventative procedure, the conversation often centers on relative risk, the percentage of improvement that sounds impressive in a headline. Ask your doctor, "What is my absolute risk reduction?" By phrasing it this way, you are asking for the raw, real-world impact on your specific health journey. Think of it as looking at the fine print of a contract. You are not just asking if a treatment works, you are asking how much it actually changes your individual probability of experiencing a specific outcome. When you see that number clearly, you can weigh it against the potential side effects, the costs, and the lifestyle adjustments required. This isn't about being skeptical for the sake of it, it's about ensuring that the trade-offs you make are worth the medical investment. During your consultation, don't hesitate to bring a notepad. You might inquire, "If 100 people like me take this medication for 5 years, how many will avoid this condition, and how many will experience a significant side effect?" This approach forces the conversation away from vague percentages and into a tangible framework. It helps you see the person behind the data, which is you. Research suggests that when patients engage in this type of shared decision-making, they often feel more confident in their treatment plans and are more likely to adhere to them. You aren't just a collection of symptoms or a set of demographic variables, you are a complex individual with unique priorities. Your doctor brings the medical expertise, but you bring the context of your own life. By insisting on absolute numbers, you gain the clarity needed to make choices that align with your values and your long-term goals. Beyond the numbers, there is a broader context to consider: the way we interpret uncertainty itself when it comes to the future of our health. Moving beyond the math, we arrive at the heart of the modern patient experience: the shift toward radical transparency. For decades, the medical establishment relied on relative risk to simplify complex data, but we are currently witnessing a necessary evolution. Informed consent is no longer just a signature on a form, it is a collaborative process built on the foundation of honest, transparent communication. Today, patient advocacy groups and forward-thinking researchers are pushing for a standard where absolute risk is the default language of healthcare. They recognize that you are not just a data point in a study, but a human being who deserves to see the full picture. When you encounter health news in the future, I want you to become an active gatekeeper of your own understanding. Whenever you see a headline claiming a treatment cuts your risk in half, Pause and ask the vital question. Half of what? Demand the baseline. When you move past the dramatic percentages and focus on the actual number of people affected, you reclaim your agency. You shift from being a passive recipient of alarming news to an empowered participant in your own wellness journey. To summarize what we have covered today, relative risk measures the proportional change between two groups, which can often exaggerate small benefits or risks. Absolute risk, by contrast, gives you the actual, tangible probability of an outcome, which is the only metric that truly matters for your personal decision-making. Always look for the raw numbers, be skeptical of headlines that omit the baseline, and never feel pressured to make a decision without the full context of the data. This content is for informational purposes only. Please consult a doctor for health concerns. Thank you for your time and for prioritizing your own clarity in a world that often prefers to keep things complicated.